Welcome everyone back to Cat's Eye on the Future. Tonight we have a very special guest back again, Kveldulfr Gundarsson. And the month of June, we're recording this in June of 2014, was announced by a recent pagan publication as being Pagan Values Month. And I thought it might be kind of fun to look at Germanic heathen values, because you often hear, particularly like if you look on Wikipedia, if you look up Asatru or Germanic heathenry, you'll see things like the 9 noble virtues or the six somethings or whatever. And I thought it would be good to ask somebody who might actually know both what were some traditional heathen values and maybe with some of the modern, how some of the modern stuff came into being and just, the whole story. So I think we maybe want to start with, what would you say would be the way the ancestors saw values and such?
Well, the ancestors really didn't seem to spend a lot of time categorizing values or listing them. The 9 noble virtues is a very modern invention, which I guess was meant to be some sort of reflection of the 7 deadly sins, or something of similar ilk. Our ancestors were not big ones for trying to define things in neat, tidy lists, partially due to being a primarily oral culture, partially because the Germanic world was never particularly homogeneous, and the ideas in one part of it in one country or village might differ significantly from the next. Also as a polytheistic religion, different cults of different deities would put a stronger emphasis on different qualities or virtues. Having said that, there seem to be some things which were more or less, as far as we can tell, universal. For instance, courage was one of the qualities most highly admired by our ancestors, and that shows up from England to Germany to Scandinavia. There was also a very strong emphasis on loyalty, and particularly to one's own family, to one's own kin, but also the loyalty of a sworn oath, such as you might see in the relationship between a Dryten, the leader of the war band, and his thanes.
Could you explain maybe a little bit about oath rings? Because people hear a lot about those.
Okay, it was the custom, at least in Scandinavia, to swear oaths on rings, usually of precious metal, and that's mentioned several times in both the Eddas and the sagas. Eyrbyggja saga describes the temple furnishings, which included a very large oath ring for this purpose. And in Havamal, Odin speaks of the vow on the ring as perhaps one of the holiest and most important. Now, the context there is he mentions that he had broken it in such an oath in the process of winning the mead of poetry. But, well, sometimes Odin does things like this. And that's also, I think, another good example of how the sense of morality, the sense of expectations could differ very much between the cult of one deity and the cult of another. There was a lot of room for diversity, for personal interpretations.
Yeah, one of the things that I've wondered about in terms of oaths is as a modern person, I have seen a number of times where oaths really got people into trouble. And I wonder if there's any particular way that people can become sort of absolved or make up for it. For example, I knew a woman who took an oath that she was going to run a pagan festival, and at the last moment she had a possible heart attack, and her doctor refused to let her out of the hospital. I mean, I don't see how she could fulfill that oath. Now, the oath should not have been taken in that manner, but that is an example of the kind of thing that I've seen.
Yeah, the only advice our forebears had on that subject was caution, and there's a number of examples, again, in various of the historical or literary sources, of people who did make unwise oaths. Often, this was young men, perhaps inspired by a little more ale than was good for them, getting up and boasting and vowing themselves to do something that really was not such a bright thing to do. And then they were pretty much stuck with it. I can't think of any examples of somebody who had sworn an oath being absolved just because things had gone south pretty badly.
Yeah, so that's just something that we need to be cautious about. And perhaps as modern people realize that, well, there's some things that maybe we just have to live with, or we have to make decisions based on lives that we have now.
Yeah, now one practice, which is becoming more and more popular, at least at group rituals, at sumbles, is to actually appoint somebody who has the duty to challenge it when somebody attempts to make an oath that is not such a good idea. For instance, swearing something that depends on the cooperation of another person, something that doesn't allow for any changes in circumstances. We actually have a role that has evolved into saying you really can't swear that oath, or that this is really not a good idea. This was not, as far as I know, ever historically done. The closest thing to a historical precedent is Unferth in Beowulf, who is not really so much challenging an oath as challenging the man who is making the boast. And that turns into a bit of a slanging match between Unferth and Beowulf, which Beowulf eventually wins. So it actually is very different from the modern practice, but that is one of the main roots from which it's evolved. Overall, I think the modern practice is a sensible one. Some groups take it a little further. Some groups insist that anyone who wants to swear an oath has to clear it with the person responsible before the horn comes around to them. And that might be a little excessive because it doesn't really allow for any spontaneous inspiration. You know, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I do think something is lost when one takes it that far.
Now that's actually moving a little bit perhaps away from the topic, but I think still relevant. You've mentioned things like sumbles and the horn and things. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what a sumble is?
Okay, well, a sumble is basically a drinking ritual. It's got a certain amount of overlap with the feast. But Paul Bauschatz, who wrote a very good book called The Well and the Tree, actually pointed out that sumble is very rarely associated with the process of eating. It seems to have primarily been a drinking ritual. And again, it's one which has changed very, very considerably between the historical times and modern times. The modern version of it has been kind of standardized, where there is a single horn that passes from person to person around the circle, and each person gets to make their toast, or their oath, or their boast, or whatever, and then they drink and pass it on. Now, historically, probably nothing like that was ever done. People tended to have their own horns or cups. Occasionally, if you were best friends or courting someone, you might share a horn or a cup with one person, but the whole passing the single thing around is completely modern. Also, as you can imagine, there's elements of practicality. As Asatru gatherings have happily continued to get larger and larger, We're seeing more and more that what was inspiring and practical for groups of 15 to 20 people is not nearly so inspiring and practical when you have 100 to 150 people, each of whom is going to say something, whether they actually felt that they needed to or not. It's become a very long, drawn-out process historically, as best we can tell. The custom was more like what's described in the saga of Haakon the Good, where the king or presumably queen or local priestly type person or whoever would make the major toast to the major gods on behalf of everyone in the hall, and then people would continue to drink, and every so often, if somebody had something really important to say, or possibly had a few too many drinks and was about to make a really stupid oath, they would just stand up and say it. It doesn't seem to have been nearly so organized, and it pretty certainly wasn't being done like a Bardic circle at a convention.
I wonder if partly the modern symbols we all come with the baggage that we have from other religions, and there are some people that have been raised in Asatru, but or even neo-paganism, but it's still rare at this point. I wonder if some of the more stylized version of the symbol comes sort of from the background of worshiping that we come into a lot from either Catholicism or Protestantism background.
I'm not sure about the symbol. I can't think of any Christian equivalents to it.
Yeah, you're probably right. Okay, I was just thinking more just the fact that it's so organized, and maybe it comes more from the Bardic Circle.
Yeah, because I think it does. And it, for smaller groups, for smaller gathering, it's a fantastic way to do it. Everyone's has their turn to speak. Everyone is essentially binding themselves closer as part of the community. I'm not so wild about the whole everybody drinking out of the same vessel, because it's a great way to pass around any colds or whatever anyone might have.
Yeah, I have the same problem with it, but that is actually though a topic of discussion. That's a current an Ivy topic, and I've actually heard people try to say things like, oh, well, we just have to trust in the gods that it will be okay. And I'm thinking, that to me is not sound like a heathen value.
It's certainly not an Odinic value. Odin warns humans pretty strictly about things like paying attention to what's around you, checking behind the door for enemies, and when Haakon the Good eventually came to Valhalla, he was very suspicious, and this seemed to be perfectly okay, approved, and quite possibly something that Odin would want to encourage. And I think the same point of view, at least from my point of view as an Odinsman, is that a similar practical caution is probably a good idea when it comes to things like sharing your germs with everyone in the circle.
Actually, I kind of like this track that we're going on. Why don't we do a few gods and goddesses that you can think of, and what would be their values or values their followers might be expected to have? For the first case, perhaps Odin.
Okay, well, the Odinic values, certainly, his heroes were expected to be courageous, often to the point of being actively antisocial, with it. They tend to be, strife stirrers, causers of trouble, frequently fairly violent, upholding family honor, particularly by means of revenge if necessary, was well up in there. And certainly wisdom and intelligence both seem to be very strong Odinic values, where we see Odin speaking to humans, interacting with humans. Either he's actually getting involved on the battlefield, or he's passing wisdom and information on to them as, for instance, we see in the Eddic poem Havamal, the speech of the High One, which is mostly a very, very long poem of good advice from Odin. On the other hand, one can fairly, I think, compare that to the cult of Freyr in particular, which seemed to be much more focused on family, on good behavior, particularly in romantic relationships, on this concept of frith, which is best translated as fruitful peace, but also has implications of smooth social functioning. And in fact, occasionally we see the cult of Odin and the cult of Freyr, or at least worshippers of Odin and Freyr, set against each other for just this reason, as in the saga of Weregild. With Thor, Thor's an interesting god there. He's very, very trusty, he's very loyal, he's very practical, and he's not necessarily all that concerned with social regulations either. There's, for instance, the story of Hrungnir. The giant is a guest in Asgardr. He's a very badly behaved guest. He's got drunk. He's threatened to take up the goddesses off and rape them. He's pissed in the mead bowl, whatever it is. Generally been offensive. And Thor is ready to pound the living snot out of him right there in the hall, despite the fact that the guy is there under guest right. Eventually things are calmed down, and it's agreed for the two of them to meet in a proper challenge, a proper duel. But that wasn't what Thor had in mind to start out with.
So hospitality only goes so far.
Hospitality only goes so far, and Thor does not seem to be a god who will let what is socially accepted or expected get in the way of doing what is right.
And on the other hand, we would have Tyr.
On the other hand, we would have Tyr, about whom we really don't know much. We have basically the one story of the binding of Fenrir, but it's a very good story in terms of defining the god's character, because there you see this very strict self-judgment. And again, Tyr actually does break his oath, because the option of not doing so is even worse. It's been prophesied, at least according to Snorri, that Fenrir is going to be a grievous threat to the gods, a grievous threat to the worlds. He's gotten very large, he's out of control, and Tyr has to straight up lie to him. But unlike, for instance, Odin, Tyr takes the responsibility of essentially punishing himself for it. His hand is more or less his Weregild to Fenrir for what he did.
Why don't you talk a little bit about the concept of Weregild?
The concept of Weregild is found throughout the Germanic world, and it was basically the social counterbalance to the very, very strong impetus for revenge. And revenge was not just, this person has hurt me, I'm going to get him back. Revenge was a matter of reclaiming the family's honor, reclaiming the family's soul, which is one of the reasons it's such a frequent theme. But if everyone goes around killing each other back and forth in revenge, this is not such a good way to keep a society functioning. So there was this alternate method whereby if somebody had injured or killed someone else, there were set payments, set financial payments, based on, social status, circumstances, a wide-ranging variety of things. And when you had injured or killed somebody, there was usually the option of making a payment to the person or to their family.
And this kind of leads into, when you're dealing with values and Weregild and family and thing, the Norse or the Germanic people seem to have been somewhat of what modern anthropologists would call a shaman honor culture. But it's a different type of shaman honor culture than what we think of today when we say look at the Islamic world, where you hear about young girls being stoned to death because they shamed the family. I think that the Germanic people had a very different view of sexuality, didn't they?
Yes. They had a very different view of sexuality. They had a very, very different view of the position of women. There are a number of sagas about people that get into trouble cheating on their partner. There doesn't seem to have been anything like the obsessive emphasis on chastity, particularly female chastity, that you get in the Western and more southern Mediterranean-ish cultures. Women had a very great deal of sexual freedom, particularly if they weren't married, although there's a few examples of women who were married and managed to get around quite a bit without apparently coming in for a lot of censure over it.
So if that isn't a form of family honor violation, what would be?
Family honor violation was more by way of sitting still while other people did something untoward to your family members. And again, this takes us back to this whole concept of revenge as a manner of wiping the shame off the family's soul, because it was considered a very untoward thing to just sit there with your mouth shut and let people wrong you or your family members. In fact, particularly in the family sagas, it's interesting in terms of how it works out in gender, because obviously turning the other cheek, the Christian type ideals, were seen as extremely unmanly. Men were expected to go right in for a punch-up if somebody had offended them. But at the same time, the people who seem most in control of what's going on in terms of family honor and revenge are actually the women, particularly the mother of grown sons, but you'll also see it with sisters, wives. The men may have been the effectors, but it seems largely to have been the women who actually determined what was going to happen.
So is revenge primarily taking place in terms of response to violence?
By and large, sometimes verbal violence, but chiefly it was a response to physical violence.
Now, how does the role of the all thing or the idea of law play in as a value in the Germanic culture?
Again, very like Weregild, the social determination of law, the social activities like the all thing, were a crucial counterbalance to this other side, to this more Odinic, less social side. If it had not been for the structure of the laws, and we even had professional or semi-professional people who knew the laws, who could recite them, the law speakers, without that we would have all killed ourselves off very early. Now, often enough, the law turned out to become a battle on another field. When you read the family sagas, you will notice that the national sport of Iceland seemed to be suing each other.
That's kind of what I was thinking of. I've mentioned this to people sometimes that, it sounds like the Icelanders could give a Hollywood divorce lawyer a run for their money in terms of, the amount of time and energy and probably money or barter that went into paying these guys.
Yeah, and sometimes there are some odd little eddies. For instance, in Brynjolf's saga, where Njal and Gunnar have found themselves in a situation mainly due to Gunnar's wife, who is just bad to the bone. But various household members of theirs keep killing each other, and the two guys are friends. They're both reasonably nice guys, and they keep giving each other the right of self-judgment and basically handing the same pouches of money back and forth for a while there.
That sounds almost like a story that you would hear around a campfire, that it just keeps getting bigger.
Yeah.
One pouch to the other pouch. I can just see it. I'm wondering now, we've done the gods, but would the goddesses or worshippers of goddesses perhaps have any different perspectives?
It's hard to tell because we know so little about the actual cults of most of the goddesses. We do see some elements here and there. For instance, Frigg is very tricky, and by no means above dropping Odin into a bad position when he annoys her, as in the Prelude to Grimnismal. We also have a continental story where she pulls a swift one so that her side of the battle wins instead of his side. Aside from that, we don't really know a lot.
Well,
just shortage of information, I'm afraid.
Well, perhaps in a little bit on, we've done this a little bit before, but in this context, in the roles of the family and values of the family, what roles did women play, and how were they expected to both contribute, and, or, for example, if a woman became divorced or widowed, was it her father's family that took her back, or just how did that work?
Well, we have to remember that Norse women were not necessarily dependent on men. We have runic inscriptions indicating that women were merchants, women ran businesses of their own, women ran their households, they could run their own lands. The marriage contracts and the provision of a dowry were usually set up, in fact, as a form of financial insurance for the woman in case of divorce. She might move back to her father's family, or she might just keep her hall and rule it on her own. The family dynamics are interesting because one thing we do notice, and this is borne out by the quantity and quality of grave goods, is that women tended to increase in status and power within the family grouping as they got older, whereas men tended to diminish. Old men's burial mounds in Norway have less grave goods, less high quality grave goods than younger men's, whereas older women's have much nicer stuff. And we see a lot of this in the sagas. I'd mentioned the mother of the grown son in particular, and the mother of the family, the lady of the family, was expected, as far as we can tell, to be the primary advisor. The menfolk may have fought or done the actual speaking in the law court, but the mama is the one who really is telling everyone what to do. And we also see this, not to quite such a marked degree, but where we see queens in action, again, their reed givers, their manipulator is such a harsh word, but they certainly are the people that arrange things, and there are several kings who get into a lot of trouble because they have offended their wives or prospective wives.
I know that Kveldulfr has not seen the Vikings for various reasons, but I am reminded of the woman who plays the role of the Jarl's wife, particularly the first Jarl. She is extremely manipulative, and I have said to several people that I thought it was actually quite a good portrayal on that particular issue of how, some of these women are reported to have acted there. She's really kind of the power behind the throne, really.
Yeah, it probably is, and it's often been remarked that we really have kind of two female archetypes within that general class. We have the Frith Weaver, the woman who perhaps is married as part of an alliance. The woman who does as Wealtheow does in Beowulf, where she comes around, honors her husband's warriors by pouring drink for them, speaking to them, keeping the hall as a nice tight woven community. So that's one side. The other side, and we see this a lot in the Icelandic sagas, is the strife stirrer or inciter, who says, Sonny or hubby or whatever, these people have offended us, go kill them.
Yeah, so basically part of their, on the one hand, one value for women would essentially be to bring peace and try to keep order, or at least people getting along. But on the other hand, they also have a responsibility to, particularly in the name of the family, to encourage men to do things that they might not want to do anyway, in order to maintain the honor or the role of position of the family.
Yeah, exactly. And the two sides have often been compared to Frigg the Peace Weaver and Freya the inciter, the strife stirrer. Certainly we do see Freya in some stories very much having this role. But on the other hand, every so often we get just a wee glimpse of Frigg that suggests that she's got this element to her character too. In Lokasenna, for instance, when Loki's slagging her off, she mentions that if Balder were there, he would basically now go and kick Loki's butt. And the whole Frigg and Balder relationship is very typical of something we see quite frequently in the Icelandic stories, with the maternal figure, with the mother magically protecting or trying to protect her grown son, not least so, in the sagas, so that he can go out and fight the physical battles on her behalf. And we see various variants of this, weaving magical shirts of protection and whatnot. In the tale of Balder, of course, it's the oaths that Frigg gets from everything but the mistletoe not to harm him. But this is an extremely common theme.
You have been listening to part 1 of Cat's Eye on the Future. We'll return to the show right after these short messages. Do you have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melody, just go to my website, melodipsychicreadings.com. That's Melody with an I, psychicreadings.com, for information, or email me at melodyreader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today? We now return to part 2 of Cat's Eye on the Future. Well, that's been really, really interesting, and I think that kind of gives us a really good introduction to kind of what the heathen values, and at least an explanation. I looked on Wikipedia, and it turns out that the 9 noble virtues seem to go back to the 1970s, and there was another set that I guess Edred Thorson did a little bit later that were not as many of them, but this kind of categorized list. And I think you're right. I really just can't imagine the people in traditional times anyway just sitting there and listing the stuff.
And I have to say something else about the, quote, 9 noble virtues, unquote, which is that the vast majority of them are not even described by Germanic words. Virtue. This is a Latin-based word, and you get the various various lists, and they're almost all Latin-based.
Why is that an issue?
That's an issue because the etymology of a word the roots of the word are basically defined and really only made fully understandable in the sense of the context from which they've come, in the sense of what they tell you about the language and the thoughts from which the language grew. So there is a big difference when you get right down to it between the Roman virtue, whereas in Germanic we might say strengths, or we might say thews. We might say any number of things, but none of them would actually translate as virtues. So it's kind of ironic that so many modern Aussetruers are depending so heavily on concepts that actually are not using Germanic words to define them.
But so, you're saying it's better to use a Germanic word when possible to describe something in the religion?
Always.
And so what about the term value then?
That's another one of them.
Well, so what would be a good, what type of words would be true? You know, if we're not going to use the term value, what would be a good Germanic way of thinking of it?
We might say troughs, we might say goods, we might not say anything at all. We might not try to pin it down that precisely, because remember, back in the day, people lived in these cultures. They were like fish not having words for water. Everyone just knew that bravery was important, truth was important. All of these things just were.
Yes, but that's why I'm trying to explore them a bit, because, for example, troth, what is that?
Yes, well, troth, for instance, it's related very closely. It's related to the true word. It's related to the trust word. Troth ultimately is something that you can rely on, something you can trust in. You keep troth with someone. You plight your troth to someone.
So we have bravery, we have courage, we have troth, we have loyalty and hospitality.
Yeah, loyalty would fall under troth, really.
Okay.
Hospitality, you'd say guest friendliness or open-handedness.
And I remember, actually, this is when I had something I meant to bring up with you. I remember years ago I asked you about charity, and you said it wasn't exactly a heathen thing. And
yeah, well, and again, we can look at the words, and charity, if I recall correctly, is from a Latin root implying love and implying a certain, very, very Christian sort of feeling to the poor downtrodden stranger. Whereas in the Norse, the closest you'd get to that would be open-handedness and guest-friendliness. It was absolutely expected that if a ragged wanderer came into your hall, that you would greet them, you would feed them. For one thing, for all you know, it might be you next winter. But it was really considered very shameful, very terrible, particularly for someone of higher social position, to be stingy with their food or goods. Certainly, there was a significant element of financial reward in the upper levels of society, because if you were a pretty much professional warrior, of course, you would probably prefer to be in the band of a king who was pretty free handing out the gold arm rings and that.
I was going to say, can you explain a little bit about the gold and silver arm rings, the idea of the ring giver or the bread giver?
It all, I suppose, comes back to this idea of open-handedness, but the arm rings were particularly important for a lot of reasons. A lot of the arm rings we see are just these kind of spiraling coils of wire. which were obviously a very practical form of currency. You could break off a coil or two from the spiral for weight, because the Norse pretty much evaluated precious metals by weight, not by specific minting most of the time. Although we certainly were minting coins reasonably early on in the Viking Age. But also, and we see this particularly in some of the possibly older stuff and the more legendary tales, the arm ring given by the Dryten to the Thane or what have you also had elements of the oath ring to it. It wasn't just an early Norse version of a paycheck. It was also a symbol of this deep personal bond, that this troth between the Dryten and the Thane. And it was expected that if you received arm rings from your lord, that when it came to a battle, you would not run off and leave him. You would die for him. And this really comes out strongly towards the end of Beowulf, where Welof is having a go at the companions who did take off, and mentions at some length, if I recall correctly, that they had received these gifts from Beowulf.
And I'm also getting this feeling of circular, again, not wanting to exactly use the term values, but that's sort of the topic. It's not just one thing, each one seems to flow into another.
Yes.
Which I think is very common in traditional cultures. And perhaps one of the things we have to do as modern people is, again, trying to re-educate ourselves to think in a more circular rather than a very linear pattern. Because again, getting back to the modern concept of like the lists of things. Lists, I think, are very sort of modern thinking. We go into an office and you're given the list of the tasks to do this day. It's also very kind of Middle Eastern monotheistic. You have the Ten Commandments, or
Middle Eastern monotheistic, very very much a product of primarily literary societies. And even though the Norse were the most literate people in Europe until the modern era, in terms of how many people could read and write, they didn't think like literate people in the same way as the Greeks or the Hebrews or whoever. They thought like an oral culture. And I think you're very much onto something with the sort of circular interweaving perceptions. Even if you look at Scandinavian art, at Germanic art, it's very complex. It's not nearly as rigorous and mathematical as the Celtic knotwork. It all has this organic, flowing, interweaving quality. In fact, you see the same thing in for instance, the structure of the poem Beowulf. It's quite long, and you see bits and pieces of the past interwoven and intermingled here and there, rather than too simple and straightforward. This happened, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened. When I was working on my novelized version of Beowulf, in fact, that I actually had some trouble with that, because of course it works very well in a poem, doesn't work quite so well in a modern novel. So I actually had to kind of straighten the plot and make it a bit more chronological than the original.
And I think finally it sort of morphs into this. One of, again, the virtue, the nine noble whatevers was, I thought, interesting, was respect for the aged. But I think you do actually see that in the culture, but not maybe quite the way that we think of it, because you've already mentioned how women's grave goods become better and men's less. And is it really age so much, or is it wisdom?
I think it's some of both. People do hopefully people get wiser with age. And when you do see old men receiving honor, they're guys like Brynn and Njaut. who is an interesting character. He's an old guy. He's very wise. He's not quite a normal man. He can't grow a beard. And this was a big deal. It just was. There is this sense that in his old age in particular, he's kind of stepped out of the normal masculine sphere and into a more neutral to even feminine sphere. And we see the same thing with Odin. You notice when we see Odin in battles, we don't see him smacking it out with his opponents generally. We see him taking the more womanly role of hovering over the battlefield, casting curses, messing with the minds of the people on the other side. So there's almost, I suppose, I wouldn't go as far as to say third gender, but at least slightly non-gendered role for the wise old man. Whereas the female role continues more or less unaltered. A woman obviously gets more power as she gets older, wiser, better to direct the people around her. But with some men, for instance, we look at Eyjot's saga, and poor old Eyjot, he's 90 years old. He's done all these amazing and only occasionally appalling things. He's possibly got Paget's disease. He's blind. He's deaf. And even the thrall maids are kind of kicking him around the kitchen. He's really not getting a lot of respect. He's really not very happy, except when he can think of a way to cause trouble.
I wonder if that might almost be sort of an unspoken or sort of literary allusion to what happens when people just live too long, which, I mean, it's not, our culture doesn't really have a concept of that we talk about, but, there is, I think people in the 19th century even understood that there comes a time when a person may have outlived all of their friends, relations, relatives, whatever, and you get this feeling in literature from that period of living too long.
Yeah, and one of the things that shows up, and again, this seems to be almost entirely a masculine thing, and some of it has been, I think, was even slightly romanticized by the antiquarian guys that wrote the sagas, and it's been a lot more played up and romanticized since. But this idea that dying in the straw was a bad thing. You did not want to die in your bed of sickness or old age. You wanted to die properly on the battlefield, like a hero. And of course, eventually, by the time it got to Snorri, with considerable influence from the Christian dualistic otherworld, it turned into this probably not at all accurately heathen idea that if you die in fighting, you go to Valhalla, and if you die any other way, you go to hell.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about controversy about that recently, who gets to go to Valhalla and who doesn't.
Yeah, and it's the Norse beliefs in the afterlife were many. They were varied. They varied by locality. They varied by family. Some people had family traditions with their own hills or mounds or what have you. There some evidence that the Norse believed to some degree in rebirth, and also there's really not a lot outside of Snorri suggesting that Hell's realm is an uncomfortable place. When we see the descriptions in Baldur's Träumer, for instance, it sounds like Hell has set up to really give Baldur a very nice reception. In fact, a reception not too unlike what a hero would find going to Valhalla. Now there are obviously some really low rent districts of the other world, but there are other parts of it.
Which sound like they make another great entire show. I guess to sum up here, what would you think, in your opinion, would be, either traditionally or modernly or both, what a Germanic heathen or a Norse person would think of? Would it be the, I don't want to use the term good necessarily, the good man, because that implies, but the proper, all societies have an archetype for what is, sort of the best person you can be, or the ideal person.
I'd say probably Beowulf. Now that's only part of the story, but at the end of the poem, Beowulf's dying, and he gives this speech about all the rotten things he hasn't done. He never caused strife between kindreds, and so forth and so on. And he's been a good king and a nice guy all around. Now somebody, I think it might have been Roberta Frank, I'm not entirely certain, but somebody was floating the theory that this was deliberately written as an anti-Volsung, anti-Othinic speech, because in fact the Volsungs at one point or another did do all the things that Beowulf's saying he didn't do, and the Volsungs were also held up as great heroes, great exemplars, though presumably you wouldn't want to send your 10-year-old kids to summer camp with them.
So basically you do have these two kind of archetypes done that would have been, people would have had sort of in the back of their minds as to, as they live their lives, what, or what they would tell their children or whatever, either directly or indirectly. This is in the water of what a man is.
Yes. And they, they're very, very different, in fact, practically polar opposites. But our ancestors felt that both were necessary. Our ancestors knew that if you didn't have the Fritz side, the more Freyr and perhaps Thor side, that society would fall apart and you'd never get anywhere. But if you didn't have that Othinic side, the wild side, also maybe not a lot of worthwhile stuff would happen. There wouldn't be anything to write poetry about.
And do we have enough evidence to say anything similar for women?
Again, I think the Frithweaver and the Inciter are kind of those two models. But one thing that's important to keep in mind when looking at genders in the Norse is that it was a normatively male culture. It was normatively masculine. And while women could get away with not being manly, they seem to have been admired more when they were.
Well, I think that's a great way to kind of sum up and to think about and to go forward with. I want to thank you for being with us this evening and explaining all of this, and I look forward to talking with you again soon.
Okay.
This has been this week's edition of Cat's Eye on the Future. I hope you all have enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a look at what's coming up in your world and your future. Join us again next time for another episode of Cat's Eye on the Future.